Thank you everybody for coming today. This is our first, in fact this is our first ever event together, David.
Exactly,
So,
yes.
David and I are now joined at the hip on all things to do with geo-economics, so I'll let David introduce himself in a second. I'm Robert, and I am the Director of Geo-economics and Strategy here at IISS. I'm also the Japan Chair. We've got a new Japan programme which I'm running. And my wonderful colleague David, fizzing about all things to do with coronavirus, Iran and BRI. Does that roughly?
And US elections.
And how could I forget?
Small thing.
So, for those that don't know you, David, do you want to just
Sure. So, I'm David Gordon, and I am Senior Advisor for Geo-economics and Strategy here at IISS. I'm a retired diplomat and intelligence officer, and in my last government position, I was the director for policy planning for Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. I was the acting chair and vice chair of the U.S. National Intelligence Council, or sort of counterpart to the Joint Intelligence Committee here in the UK, and I go back and forth between London and Washington, and you know, London these days is a more stable place to be, so that's all good.
all relative, David. Thank you, David. You have to bear with me because this is week 6 or 7 here at IISS for me. Previous to this, I was with the Economist Group, where I was for a long time, 23 years, and I just thought what IISS is doing is so interesting. I'm just going to cut the links and move on. So here I am, and one or two of my slides have got EIU data in, which I actually worked on. So I think I'm still allowed to use it, but do ask if you've got any questions. Obviously, the format for this will be I'll speak for about 15 minutes. I've got the clock over there, brilliant. David will speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have about 30 minutes for Q&A. So, and ask anything. If we can't answer, we'll get back to you if we can. So, the year started pretty dramatic fashion. I've sort of lost track of how many fires are burning, actually. And the last one I was expecting was coronavirus, and of course we're all sort of looking at that to see the impact. David's got some good thoughts on the impact there. But I think one of the key things when you're thinking of the sort of geo-economics of it, and let me go to the first slide, is that a lot of these things that are going on in the world are actually quite negative for growth. And these data were put together before the coronavirus outbreak, and you've got two things. One is here, you've got the on the bars, that's global GDP growth, and the other one is global trade growth there. And what you can see, if you actually, this is just about keeping pace, global trade growth, just about keeping pace with global GDP growth. What you can see is that the world really doesn't have much buffer in terms of if you have a negative shock to the economy. There's not actually much sort of fat to absorb the shock. You also had in 2018, 2019, a really quite big step down in growth. The biggest step down actually since when you had the Greek sovereign crisis at the beginning of the decade. So where we are now is 2020, and bear in mind, this slide was done before the coronavirus, and even then, when there's quite a few tailwinds in the economy, it was pretty much flat. If you have IMF sort of broad definition is if you have about 3% growth, that is sort of a kind of recessionary conditions, and you can see here we're just sort of heading back, just heading back to 3 there. So the world is looking a little bit recessionary. As David will talk about in Q1, there will be a sort of severe shock to the Chinese system, and that will knock through into other countries as well. So we'll have a sort of bad Q1, probably a bad Q2. I've just got back from Japan, where I was last week, and tumbleweeds. All my hotel completely empty. Fantastic for me, obviously, because I get all the best tables and everything, but obviously not good for retail or hoteliers or restaurant or anything like that in Japan. The other thing which you can't quite see, which I should have sort of put this on a slightly different scale, is in the boom years, so take you back to the glory days, China just got to the WTO in 2001, global trade growth outpaced global GDP growth by quite a lot. Where we are now, actually it's just sort of broadly keeping pace. And as you saw here in 2019, there was the trade war, and there was the downturn in the electronic cycle as well. So these things were sort of pushing, trade growth down. We've got a bit of a recovery there, but again, it's not really much to write home about. If you're thinking about areas of the world to worry about, I'm looking at Latin America. Latin America is looking pretty grim. If you look at Mexico, for example, just growing a little bit more than it did last year. Actually, last year it was flat. Brazil, about 2% growth, I think, is the consensus there for an economy like Brazil's development level. That's not really enough. Argentina, another year of contraction as well. ASEAN, on the other side, is looking quite good. And of course, we're all looking at what's going on with China. If I was looking at another country to worry about, it would be India. So India's growing around about 6%. That is broadly, in my view, stagnation. 5% is roughly stagnation, given all the people they've got to absorb into the labour force every year. It's about 10 or 15 million, so they need far more than 5% really to get the economy going. India could be one of those great sort of missed opportunities if growth doesn't really pick up into double digits like it did with China. Let's just... Oh, there... Did you like that? I'm going to do it again, actually.
I like that a lot.
This is my economist days. So I borrowed that. I love it, actually. No matter where you sit on the Trump divide, and I always try and leave my audiences in doubt where I sit, so I try to be completely neutral. This is a brilliant capturing of everything to do with him. And I'm just going to talk, let's get three. This is basically trade war, and I found three nice quotes about him. This is one of my favourites by Adrian Wooldridge from The Economist, the New York Times, that Trump is a winner with the soul of a loser.
Yeah, no, that's a good one.
It's a good one, because
yeah.
it means why that is so good, in my view, is because he's a very difficult person to campaign against. So whoever is Democrat candidate, I feel sorry for them, because this is quite a mix. My favourite one, though, is he may be one of those figures in history, this is from Kissinger in the FT, who appears from time to time to mark the end of an era and to force it to give up its old pretences. So when I'm thinking about Trump, I'm thinking about you've got to play the ball and not the man. If you play the man, you sort of go into the Trump world and you probably lose your way, never get out. But what he's doing with China, I think he's identified some quite interesting, quite important things about China. One, of course, is there is sort of this level playing field, subsidies, and so on. Had phase one of the trade deal, and there wasn't really much movement in the markets as far as I could see. A little bit of sort of kind of relief that at least there was a bit of a lull. Unfortunately, phase one, of course, didn't address the key structural differences over between the US and China, which is in terms of the subsidies, in terms of the differences on tech, and so on. So my message to you would be, let's enjoy the quiet while we've got it. And Xi Jinping obviously needs a bit of time to devote to the domestic economy. Trump wants to devote it to the election, but the logic of this standoff between these two, you cannot solve it in the way that phase one was trying to do. China is trying to indigenize its technological capabilities, and that makes perfect strategic sense to Xi Jinping, made in China 2025. So there's all part of that. You can't really get away from that. And of course the US, for also good reasons, has decided that this is not acceptable with the US's in terms of great power relations. So phase one, yes, let's take it, but phase two and phase three will be very difficult indeed, and there will be more friction. Last couple of slides now before I hand to David. This is one of my, I think, some economics charts are just so beautiful. And this is one of them. This is just extraordinary because you've got the history of the US economy since 2008, and it's just an amazing thing that's happened here. First, of course, you had that, if you remember back 2008, 2009, it was such a terrible time, and the US labour market, very flexible, unemployment just shot up very quickly. But look at this. Of course Donald Trump's claiming credit for it. Of course he is, because he's a politician. But it did start before he appeared. But this is a really important tailwind, I think, if you're thinking about who's going to win in November. Because the economy, yes, it's slowing down. But if you're a consumer, you probably won't really notice it quite yet. And the labour market is really still quite extraordinary. Yes, there are problems there, long-term unemployment and so on. But this picture, I think, gives Trump a very strong tailwind with another rate cut, I think, in about March. The other one to look at very quickly is Europe, and Europe this year is the Eurozone is going to struggle because Germany's been hit hard by the trade war. It's been hit hard by the structural changes in the auto sector. The Greek crisis is still bubbling. It hasn't gone away. If you go to Athens, it's wrecked. The place is absolutely wrecked. All the young, capable people have all gone. Just left the older people and the tourists. So Greece is still sort of bubbling away, but it's not. It's sort of chronic rather than acute. One I would look at is Italy, because they've obviously got a quite bubbly politics. And obviously, again, the markets are very focused on Italian debt. Very difficult for them to pay that back, given that they can't really grow. And you've got sort of underscoring just how fragile the Eurozone is at the moment. We've got QE2, so quantitative easing 2, probably going to last until 2021. This is, again, a good chart because it just shows you what some of the weaker countries in the Eurozone are struggling with. This is Italy. And this is Italy's economy, and of course it fell down there at the great financial crash. Then it went, when you had the Greek sovereign crisis, it went down again. And it won't actually get back to what it was before the financial crisis in terms of the size of its economy until about 2025. So again, to give you an idea of sort of fertile hunting ground for populists like Salvini and co. Just last couple of slides on China. David's going to talk more about China. China is in a period of structural slowdown. And like all of us, this is not something to be afraid of. As you get older as a human being, you are able to do less, aren't you, David? I certainly am.
Absolutely.
And that's normal. And just like with an economy as well, as economies mature, they get slower and it gets more difficult to get growth going. And this is China's debt. And it's not a problem at the moment, but you can see how high the debt is. 2008 financial crash, this is when they did the mother of all fiscal stimuli, monetary stimuli, and it's gone up and up and up. For a country at this stage of development, it is high. You've got the corporate debt is high. So this is like in Japan, it's the debt is a thing sort of hanging over the economy. Because the capital account is closed, it's not going to tank the economy, but it's something that will sort of be deflationary over the longer term. I was comparing how this was with Japan in 1989, and some of these metrics, I think, for companies especially, is higher than in 1989 for Japan. And this is when Japan had its enormous bubble, when the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was worth all of California. So. And China is there already in terms of its debt burden. There are differences between China and Japan, which we'll talk about later, but this is a problem for them. And the other one that I'm following really very closely indeed is demography. And this is from my alma mater, the EIU. We did some work which I sort of joined in with, looking at long-term demographic trends. And this is the labour force, so I should have put that on the chart. Look at this. China will lose over 100 million, what is that, between 2010 and 2050, yes. That's a lot of people falling out of the population. So China's population the labour force is now falling slightly. Population will also start to fall quite soon. Japan, Russia, Thailand as well. You may not have realised Thailand is also demographically challenged, ageing population. South Korea, all of East Asia. But for China, of course, this is a problem because, as with Japan, as with other countries, having this sort of adverse demography sort of does pull you down. And these are the winners, actually. And I looked at a few numbers the other day. If you do a straight line between now and about 100 years from now, Nigeria's population is actually bigger than China's. Now that's obviously not going to happen because people don't behave in straight lines, but this gives you a sense of the difference in dynamism between the economies. And let me leave you with just 5 geo-economic risks to consider. I had thought putting India in, because India sort of keeps worrying me. I was such a champion of India's growth, of its ability to take on China and so on, but it's really just sort of gone into the sand. But and obviously its impact on the wider region from the nationalism that Modi's following. But some of these are obvious. The China-US trade tensions spill over into finance. This is something to watch, because if it does spill into finance, this is very bad news for the global economy. Indeed, I'm sort of conflicted about decoupling. If you look at the problems that the global economy is having with the coronavirus, you just get a sense of just how integrated that China is with the rest of the world. So I think decoupling more broadly is quite difficult. Obviously, in the tech core, it's where you're going to get it most obviously. But I'm a bit sceptical you're going to get it right throughout in all the industries. But the one to watch is if the trade tensions spill into finance. That would be very bad news. Also watch US and EU. The EU has had a reprieve in November last year, but this is election year. Trump may need another victory, or may need just to keep poking allies in the eye. So do watch this, because this would be bad news. As we've seen, the Eurozone is looking quite slow. Just a worry about China as well. This has been a very bad 18 months for Xi Jinping. Everything that could have gone wrong has gone wrong, and just the response of that, how Xi Jinping will respond internally, I think will be interesting to see. We want China to be part of the world. I don't want China to turn inwards, because that would be bad news for stability. Latin America, again, is somewhere that I think is looking really quite sickly. If you remember last year, we had unrest in Bolivia. Chile hasn't gone away. Ecuador as well, Peru, Argentina, Venezuela, all of them are under pressure. And this, given the sort of development level of the region, is something to worry about as well. And I did put US presidential election in there, but
that's a good segue. That's a good segue.
It's a very good segue to David, who will give us all there is to know about the US presidential election. Anyway, over to you, David.
Great. Thank you very, very much. Excellent overview. So, in the last several years, when organizations like Davos have queried CEOs on what's their largest concern, it's invariably been, we think we understand the economics, but we're really worried about the geopolitics in the world. There's been a lot of geopolitical tension. The interesting thing is, in an economic and financial sense, the geopolitical dog has barked, but it really hasn't bitten very much. It may have nipped a little bit at some feet, but there really hasn't been a large geopolitically driven bite. So that as we look out to 2020, might there be a chance for that to change? So what I'm going to talk about today are the 3 issues that I think potentially are risks to the continuity in that geopolitical bark, but not big geopolitical bite. But the base case, I don't really think at the end of the day that any of them are likely to have that kind of a large impact. That doesn't mean that there aren't going to be interesting things to follow here. So let me start with the U.S. election, and then I'm going to turn to Iran risk, and then I'm going to conclude with some comments on China and the economic impact of coronavirus. So on the U.S. election, I think that Robert has the main story right, that the economic conditions in the United States are particularly strong now for President Trump. I think that in electoral terms, it's labor market conditions that tend to dominate above others, and the relevant labor market elements of unemployment very, very, very low, wages rising and rising more for the lower echelons of the job force, voluntary job leaving very high, a lot of new people coming into the market. So in the most recent report that was issued just last week, it was quite interesting because the job creation number was almost 100,000 higher than anticipated, but the unemployment rate actually went up. And that's a good thing, because that meant that more people are coming into the workforce. The U.S. workforce now has many more job openings than people looking for jobs. So getting people back into the workforce is actually a positive thing. So where might the risks come from here? So I think one risk is in the Democratic primary, where it's looking increasingly the case that the Democratic nominee could be a political figure from the left, and by far the most likely individual to fill that role is not going to be, as we thought a few months ago, Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts. Rather, it's more likely to be Senator Bernie Sanders from Vermont. Now, Senator Sanders has been in politics a very long time. He's very left-wing, so he makes Elizabeth Warren look pretty conservative, and I think that if Senator Sanders does well tomorrow in the New Hampshire primary, particularly if former Vice President Biden doesn't do well, then you could really have the beginnings of a little bit of market froth around, oh my God, the Dems are actually going to nominate somebody from the left. Now that nomination, I think the chances of Senator Sanders becoming president are not high, even if he gets the nomination. I think he's going to have a very, very, very hard time capturing states that the Democrats would have to have. But if he wins big tomorrow, Biden doesn't do well, he has a momentum heading into the broader primaries at a time when on the moderate side there's no real clear choice. I think the chances of Bernie Sanders emerging as the nominee increase. That will create, I think, an ongoing period of the possibility of market uncertainties coming into the U.S. economy. The big uncertainty, though, that it would potentially exacerbate, especially if Trump's numbers begin to go back down. So Trump's numbers now, they've reached in the last two polls, the public opinion polls have given Trump 47% and 49%. If he sustains those numbers, he gets reelected. But if he goes down to where he had spent most of his presidency, in the low 40s, then you could have the context of a very competitive election. In the context of a competitive election, I think all sorts of issues around the legitimacy of the result could come into play, leading to some civil unrest, a lot of state-level legal actions, and really for the first time, the potential of a substantial delegitimation of the U.S. election. And I think that's the really big looming risk. Is there a big probability of that? No, it's a tail risk, and the tail is not that fat, but that would be quite a stunning thing. So U.S. election risk is out there. Iran. I think that the picture presented by the media and certainly by President Trump of the end game of the U.S.-Iran tit-for-tat of several weeks ago isn't really accurate. And in particular, that the retaliatory attack by Iran on the U.S. Al-Assad Air Base was not a de-escalatory action. So if the Al-Assad Air Base is the size of this room, the really built-up section of it is where my friend is sitting right here. That's where all of the missiles came. Now, Iran did give warning, and all the people were underground in bunkers, but there were 35 pretty severe injuries. That could have translated into a lot of fatalities, in which case we'd be living in a completely different world right now. So President Trump did not want to retaliate, and he gave the impression that this was de-escalatory. Wasn't, and the Iranians are not necessarily through. So if you're really looking for a big geopolitical risk that could translate back in, might the Iranians do something either elsewhere in the Gulf, in Saudi Arabia? They've acted in Latin America before. There are lots of places, and if you're looking at where is a very geopolitical risk that could translate into a market and economic challenge, it's Iran-U.S. relations, combined with the fact that the key strategist who kept Iran for the last 20 years on this side, on the no side of open conflict with the United States, was General Qasem Soleimani, who was killed. And so he's gone. So the risks here, I think this is something that's way underappreciated. Let me talk for a few moments about coronavirus and about expectations for the economic impact. So I'm really struck by what I think are way overly modest assumptions of an impact of maybe 50 basis points, 100 basis points, 0.5% to 1% off of the growth rate. This seems almost implausibly low to me. So if you just look at tourism, so tourism in 2018 was 11% of China's GDP. When the SARS, during the year that had the most active impact of SARS, tourism to China was down 25%. If you look at what's been happening to tourism over the last several weeks, just the numbers of people entering into China have plummeted. And if you just make a modest assumption that over the next several months that those numbers are going to remain well under 50% of what would be expected tourism levels, and then the recovery will be gradual because people aren't going to all of a sudden think, okay, everything's okay, I'm going to do my China vacation now. I postponed it in February, but it's now June, I'm going back. I don't think that's going to be the trajectory here. The potential for an economic recovery, I think, being V-shaped is pretty strong. For a tourism recovery, the V-shape is completely unimaginable to me. I would say under the best scenario, China loses 20% of its tourism in 2020. That translates into 2% of GDP. And so if you add to that what's happening now on consumption, so people in China are staying home. They're not going out for good reason. Consumption levels have taken a very, very big hit. So China, a year and a half ago, at the time of the imposition of U.S. tariffs, there was a quite similar response in China because the fear of tariffs had been played up in the Chinese media, and the government, I think, was taken aback by the degree to which consumer spending contracted in the final months of 2018 and early 2019. I believe that China has tried to keep consumer sentiment high by giving very rosy expectations for where the economy is going. But consumers are still staying home. All sorts of stores are closed, big enterprises are closed. If you add to this the impact of transportation disruptions, I think that the actual economic impact in Q1 is really going to be that most of the growth in the Chinese economy, if not all of it, is going to go away. Q1. Now, definitely, if we're on a trajectory that's a hopeful one, that is that coronavirus sort of peaks in the next several weeks and then begins to diminish, and that's, I mean, nobody knows, but epidemiologists believe that if with luck and continued good responses, that's a likely chance that we'll be going there. Then I do think there will be a V-shaped economic recovery. But if you take away all of growth for Q1, and with the sustaining of the hits on tourism well beyond Q1, in my view, that I just think this is going to be a very weak year. Now, this translates into the world economy in a couple of ways. One is just by the demand factor, and so I think that just the loss of demand will have a substantial impact. So the chances of a recession in 2020, I think, have gone way up as a result of coronavirus. But there's for the region, I think there's a second huge transmission belt, and that is that outward bound tourism has also gone virtually to nil. And outward bound tourism from China is an enormous component of the economies in Southeast Asia, even a real and substantial piece of both Japan and South Korea. So that I think that the tourism piece has two sides. One is it's the sector that is most likely to take the largest hit domestically, but then it's also the key transmission belt for really creating substantial challenges, particularly, but not only in Southeast Asia. So all of this is based on a relatively benign outlook. If that outlook is not achieved, if we're really talking about the numbers going up into 500,000 to a million affected people, which is completely plausible. And the time frame is kicked out into the second or even the third quarter. That, in my view, is the most likely scenario where this blows back into the financial markets, because then we're talking about a set of impacts both in China and being transmitted more broadly that could be substantially more negative. So my view is that the best case, that the impact is going to be much more substantial than people are projecting. But the real threat is, what if we're not in an epidemiological best case scenario, and that would, of course, have enormous challenges for both China and the world economy. Anyway, with that,
bombshell.
We will open up the floor to further questions or comments. If I could ask people to just identify themselves, that would be great. Please.
Jonathan Moore from the Ministry of Defence. Interested in what you just said. It's good news for American males in their 70s and also for greenhouse gas emissions. So let's think on the positive side. On that matter, things are never as bad as they seem. They're never as good as they seem. Are there any countervailing factors that you can identify?
Oh, countervailing positive factors. Oh, I think there's a lot of positive elements going on in the world. Certainly, the U.S. economy is very, very, very strong. So that's definitely a positive impact. I don't believe that I see any kind of financial bubbles emerging that would create risks for a financially driven market downturn. Again, if China has a real huge growth shock, that could drive that. But I don't see us heading into anything that looks like 2008, for instance. And even in China, I do think when this ends, the economic recovery is likely to be V-shaped. And so I don't see any likely long-term structural negative implications of this for China, particularly if we're in the first scenario. I think that the rest of the world, scenario is, I think that Robert's right about Latin America. Europe is a more complicated case, but as I said at the beginning, for all of the geopolitical tensions, I think the likelihood of a geopolitically driven crisis economically is also quite limited. I think the Iran threat is that, and that's a tail risk. It's not a base case, but I think that the economic outlook, if you can take away coronavirus and assume a best case scenario, and if President Trump, if the U.S. election ends up not being that close, then the outlook for the second half of 2020 is actually brighter, substantially brighter than the first half.
Does Mr. Ward have any views on countervailing?
So, there are some bright spots, one of which is ASEAN, and ASEAN's doing pretty well. Vietnam's doing exceptionally well within the ASEAN context. So ASEAN's sort of odd beast. I mean, it's got the most grim politics, yet the economy just keeps on ticking over. I think at sort of 4% or so growth, which is higher than the global average. Also, Bangladesh is, I think, the world's fastest growing economy this year, partly because it's been benefiting a bit from the trade war, so decoupling. On the decoupling side, again, some of the industries that have been leaving China would have done so anyway, because the Chinese government wants to sort of shed the lower value added stuff. So the trade war may have just accelerated things that already would have happened anyway. But Bangladesh has done well. I think the bigger issue is that there is a big problem that the tools in the big economies have all been used up. So Eurozone, interest rates at zero, QE happening again. UK, not much room for any further loosening really. US rates are already pretty low. Japan's had zero rates for about 20-something years now. So if the world has a problem with growth, it can't get fast enough growth for what we need, and the tools to deal with recession have been used up. So that's why I think the balance of risk is a bit precarious at the moment. That's why China is so important. Because if you think about, David talked about Asia, look at the Gulf as well, countries like Oman, countries like UAE, China is a big market for them. Saudi as well, big market for them. So the sort of Chinese...
And oil prices stay very low
down,
if this extends.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's why I think at the moment, perhaps definitely until the coronavirus runs its course, the balance of risks I think is tilted on the negative side. But more broadly, people have been lifted out of poverty. I mean, some countries in Africa are doing better than others, and so on. Some bright spots, but they're not in the sort of the locomotives of global growth at the moment.
Tim Dowes, member of the Institute. I'm struck that in both your presentations, you mentioned Russia, and I wondered.
Where's that?
I wondered, it's too surprising given the amount of time and energy that Russia absorbs in Western foreign ministries. I just wondered whether the reason it hasn't been mentioned is because you regard it as pretty marginal to both global economics and indeed global geopolitics.
So Russia's certainly not marginal to global geopolitics, but I do think it is basically marginal to geoeconomics. It has a role to play, obviously, that the main relationship now among oil-producing countries is no longer traditional OPEC. It's Saudi, UAE, Russia. So the Russians play in that. And of course, the Russians use economic tools of influence in their near abroad. But in terms of the larger international economy, no, I think Russia really is not a particularly significant player.
Russia's kind of an odd beast, actually. It's quite difficult to talk about with all the other countries. And as David said, it economically, I mean, it is a sort of definitely second-rate player. I mean, growth is really slow. Again, about 1% if they're lucky, and some of that's sort of self-inflicted, of course, by not reforming, not creating a business SME foundation, if you like. Innovation's not that good either. Business environment is not good either. But it's got sort of strange siege economy feel to it. So you've got very low public debt. The central bank's pretty well run. It's got reserves and so on. So it's sort of got quite a sort of solid base, but it can't grow. So as an economic actor, it's hampered by that. But I think Russia's played I mean, it's got a bad hand that it's playing quite well, just by needling and destabilising and so on. So I don't count myself in the camp that looks sort of dismisses Russia outright because that's not right, because it is I mean, having a destabilising role is also quite a significant one. But the economic outlook, I think, is quite poor, and obviously politically, with Putin, with his sort of balletic attempts, choreography to try and stay in power. I mean, this is not doing Russia's sort of economy much good either. This will start here and then move to this side. Yeah.
Let's take more than one question at a time.
Yeah, let's do that.
Please.
Donella Rosa from Rosa Rubini Associates, also LSE's the University and Bocconi University. One question for each of the subjects touched by David. Very quick ones. One would be whether on US presidential election believes that Bloomberg might play a role at that point in time. Second, just a confirmation of Soleimani's position vis-a-vis potential deal with the US, because there were theories that were saying, in fact, it was the one that was creating the obstacle to have a deal, and so not having him around might actually facilitate things. And third, on the coronavirus, there have been plenty of reports suggesting the coronavirus might have somehow escaped involuntarily the laboratory that is in Wuhan on the deadly diseases that are kept there and studied and so on. Thank you.
Should we take the batch? Yes. Dana.
Hi, Sanjay Karan, WHO, seconded to LSE.
Please.
Considering coronavirus.
Yeah.
You said there might be a V-shaped recovery to the coronavirus.
Economic recovery, yes.
Leadership has changed from SARS to Ebola to now, a rapid change in leadership around the world. Do you think the coronavirus could be a permanent stain or on the Chinese
Xi Jinping?
Yeah, and you can see the effects down the line later on, 5-10 years' time.
Okay. Yeah. Dana.
Yeah, Dana Allen from the Institute. David, on Sanders.
Yep.
I'm curious. I mean, you emphasize that he's quite far left, and that I think you were suggesting a potential major financial market or economic response to.
I think there could be some market stuff. Yes.
I just wonder how clever markets are in that case. Because
markets aren't clever.
Because the one thing that strikes me about Sanders is he does two things. One, he does, as you say, I think, increase the likelihood that Trump is reelected.
Yes.
If Sanders became president, I think he has no theory of the case. We're actually instituting some of his more left-wing policies in a
practical way.
It's completely divided. Right. He's just not going to do it. So I just wonder why markets couldn't understand that. The other thing, though, that I'm really interested in is about legitimacy, because I mean, what are you talking about? Are you talking about Trump refusing to move out of the White House?
I think that's not a totally implausible scenario.
Take one more question then, and then deal with them as a batch, David. Yep.
On the slides that you showed at the beginning, that shows the slowdown on trade growth. Do you think we're seeing or entering a period of reversing of globalization? Obviously, there's all the geopolitical aspects to the trade war, etc. Also, on the more kind of still on the political level, for example, in Europe, we might see the carbon adjustment tax, which might make it no longer economically interesting for companies to outsource production to China, etc. But also on the technological front, now you can, instead of buying a car part from China, you might print it in a 3D printer or something like that.
That's a couple of years away.
Yeah, but more kind of in the longer run, whether we might see, let's say, less globalization, but more regionalization of supply chains.
Do you want to have a go at some of those?
So, Bloomberg, definitely, I think so. Bloomberg needed a Biden fall off in the first couple of weeks. It looks as if that scenario could be coming into place. So I think Bloomberg can definitely not be fully discounted, but it's not as if he has the field to himself. But yes, he's in the game. And if Biden gets a bad result in New Hampshire, as he probably will, he'll be more in the game. Soleimani and deals. Is a deal more likely in the absence of Soleimani? I believe it is. I believe that's right. And in my view, I think if the Iranians perceive that the election is really not going to be competitive, I think that there could very well possibly be an opening here to initiate negotiations even during 2020. If I think that the Iranians wanted to try to wait this out in the hope that there would be an alternative to Trump. If they believe that's not going to happen, they may conclude that earlier may be better. I don't give credence to the view that coronavirus is an escape bioweapon. It doesn't have the characteristics of an effective bioweapon. So I think that's propaganda.
Just quickly do trade, your globalization question. I think that globalization has plateaued. I think there are no votes really for politicians being very pro-globalization. It's politically not like it was. I think the big question is, does it reverse? I think that battle is to be had. WTO looking pretty weak now with the appellate crisis still bubbling as far as I'm aware. There'll be some decoupling at the core tech. I can't see how that cannot happen, how that is avoidable, given the strategic concerns that the US has about what China is doing and China's strategic imperative to do that, and China's indigenization push with its technology as well. So all the sort of the pressures are against globalization at the moment, and I think it's companies, MNCs have to really think about their message, how they function, how they look after those in their HQ as well, because it's far more politically difficult than it ever has been.
Just let me make a brief comment, Dana, on aren't the markets overreacting here? I think the overwhelming view in the markets was that this was really going to be a very low-risk election, that Trump was likely to win, that if it wasn't Trump, it was going to be a Democrat with very moderate views. So I think up until very recently, they saw no risk. So the Bernie risk is taxation, and that's he's not going to be able to do very much. What it would take to enable him to win would probably imply that the Democrats would increase their stance in the House of Representatives, possibly come to even in the Senate. So, I don't think this is an overreaction. I think that Bernie risk is real.
Gentleman at the back.
Yeah.
Shah from China. You talk about the coronavirus and its impact on China's economy.
Yes.
How would you look at the more long-term prospect of the Chinese economy? Because you see there's the V shape or whatever shape, but in the long run, are you still confident of it?
Yeah.
Because some Americans are talking about withdrawing their factories from China back to the United States in light of the virus Do you think this is something that will be an option in years to come?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's off to you.
Yeah, so I think I agree very much with Robert that the Chinese economy is structurally shifting. The big growth period that was demographically driven, the rural to urban migration transition, low productivity to higher productivity. I think that period, if you want to read an economist that understands what's been happening in China over the last 25 years, it's Sir W. Arthur Lewis, who was writing a half century or more ago, and he explains China very, very, very well. So I think that we don't know yet what a new equilibrium will be for the Chinese economy. My view, and getting to your question, I don't believe that there will be any permanent impact of coronavirus. Huge. On the other hand, if it lasts a long time, if we're in a longer-term scenario, it could increase the speed and possibly the scale of the shift in supply chains towards Southeast Asia, and so that might do it. I think that if we're in a second scenario, I think that coronavirus becomes much more of a challenge to the political authorities and to President Xi Jinping. Now, you know, I think that China still needs to make some big changes, and the question that I have is, how are they eventually going to find a way to open up the financial system? Because if they really want to be a global financial power, they have to open up the financial system. And right now, any opening of the financial system in China would lead to a huge surge in capital flight. So it's, what are the mechanisms? How does China get from here to there? That's not going to be an issue in the next few years because they're not ready for that. But that's the big challenge facing China in the 3 to 5 year period, in my view.
I mean, China is inevitably slowing. As I said earlier, China's maturing, and mature economies grow more slowly than developing economies. I think for Xi Jinping, the challenge is, and for the rest of us actually, given China's importance, is how to engineer a gentle deceleration.
That's right.
And as you saw in the chart, China is still, the government is trying to sort of tread this line between doing some reforms, but also just keeping growth fast enough, so absent coronavirus, so that political targets are met, and and all of that. My concern is that Xi Jinping is not reformed sufficiently, is not market friendly enough. He's sort of politicizing the economy, and this is bad news for China's ability to grow over the long term. And of course, as you saw in the demography chart, China really does have quite a sort of significant headwinds to growth from demography, from debt, from the structural change. So it needs to unleash reform, as David said absolutely rightly, particularly on the financial sector. And that comes down to capital account and the renminbi, and those are obviously very difficult, and I think the government's doing the right thing in being gradual about liberalisation, but at some point the government does have to sort of let go, and that, I think, for this particular government is going to be quite difficult. So definitely growth. I don't believe the 6% growth that is official. I don't think anybody does. So I suspect that growth in China now is heading down towards 5%, and in the middle of this decade you'll be down into the 4%.
Right.
So you've got less growth to play with, which means that the growth you do get needs to be generated in an optimum way. So how long?
2 more questions here. 3 more questions, then these will be the last round. Yes.
Right, so Pierre from King's College. Just 2 questions regarding climate change. Do you consider environmental disaster as a risk of the global economy? And the second one, with the pressure for economic transition, and knowing that sustainable growth is mostly wishful thinking, how will an economy based on fossil fuel consumption will survive?
Okay.
Political pressure?
Yeah. Thank you. And there were 2 more questions.
Shall I go, because my question's quite linked.
Okay, yeah, please.
So Tom Mills from 2H Strategy, a research consultancy. Just following on from that, with COP26 coming up in November, do you think that has the potential to exacerbate geopolitical tensions, and could that spill over into geopolitical geo-economic risk?
Thank you. And the question at the back, yep.
I'm Archana from King's College. My question is related to India, basically. With the current levels of growth coupled with nationalism, how far do you think will it have an impact on the economics in the middle and the long term?
Do you want to go for climate change?
Yeah, just so I think right now, particularly in Europe, the politics of climate change are running ahead of the economics of climate change. And if you look at Germany, you have this big commitment to green growth. On the other hand, you have the outsourcing of nuclear power to France and coal to Poland. So it's that the politics and the economics aren't in sync. In the U.S., the politics and the economics aren't in sync, except from the other direction. So I do think that this all becomes more challenging over time. I think one of the big geopolitical issue here will be the EU carbon taxation plan, and I don't think that is likely to really become manifest this year, but that it will at some point. So that's where I see the rubber hitting the road.
So on India, what's happened with India is it reminds me a bit of what happened in Turkey with Erdogan. So Erdogan 1.0 kept the politics out of the economy, and then Erdogan 2.0 decided, right, we're going to stick the politics right in the economy, and then you have all the sort of turbulence comes back to Turkey's economy. Modi's sort of doing something similar there. He came to power with a kind of reputation, whether it was justified or not, for being a reformer, and he's done some reforms. Demonetisation. It was a bit like being sort of bludgeoning the economy. But the reasons why he wanted to do it were fair enough. He wanted to sort of shrink the informal size of the economy. And if you talk to foreign business operating in India, it's very difficult in terms of the arbitrariness of rules, bureaucracy, in terms of laws being changed and retroactively applied, and so on. And of course, as everybody knows, the direction since the re-election of Modi has been towards quite a sort of Hindu nationalist view of what India is, and sort of really key reforms that need to be undertaken. I mean, the financial sector's pretty ropey in India, the state-owned banks and so on. So these are all things that any country would have to reform. India needs to do it, but because of, I think, the complexion of Modi's government, he's looking at the political goals rather than the economic ones. And of course, with India, if you think, for example, of AI, is a threat for India. Think of all the call centres and all all these jobs that can be just taken out with a bot, and India has to absorb 10 million plus new workers every year. So I think the Indian government's got some real deep thinking to do about the structure, the economic structure of the economy. India's missing middle, has missed out that manufacturing bit, which, as China's shown, is fantastic for giving out income and skills and so on. So I think India, a lot of countries, to my last point, to your geopolitical point, a lot of countries are putting a lot of hope in India. I know that Japan is, for example, looks at India as pivotal to its Indo-Pacific strategy. My concern is that unless India really sorts out its economics, actually it's going to be an unreliable partner for some of these countries that actually need it to be a very reliable partner. And growth of 6% just doesn't cut the mustard. India needs to be punching out, and it can, 10-15% growth. 6% isn't enough, unfortunately.
Great. Okay. I'm sorry. One last question. Yes, sir.
Last question.
Please.
Can I add some quick comments?
Oh, yes.
The coronavirus will have some impact on the Chinese economy.
Yes.
It's true. But I think the impact will be temporary, short.
Yes.
And we have taken very vigorous and aggressive measures to put it under control. We have completely built 2 emergency hospitals within 10 days. I don't think other countries can complete build hospital with such efficiency. And thousands of doctors are rushing to Dubai to support the emergency service. So I think it's true that many consumers will hope, but I don't think they spend money. They just defer their consumption. After the overall disease, they will continue to spend more domestically and overseas. So I think we have confidence to beat the disease, not only with the joint efforts of the Chinese people, but also with the help of the whole world. We also appreciate help from the British brands, British governments. Second, with China's opening of the financial service, I don't think the virus will stop China from further opening. Actually, from January 1st, we have adopted new foreign investment guidelines with regulations, and we have also advanced the restriction on ownership in financial and foreign financial institutions from year 2021 to 2020 in this year. So China's financial market, is more open to the outside. And I think we welcome more foreign investment in China. Thirdly, gentlemen mentioned the COP26. This year, UK will hold the COP26, and China will hold COP15 for biodiversity. So it's a very good opportunity for both countries to strengthen cooperation on climate change and green development. So we hope we can make joint efforts to put forward green development, not only in China, in the UK, and all over the world.
Thank you.
On that optimistic note.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, Robert.
Thanks everybody for coming.